Peace, family. This is Tariq. Welcome back again for another day, another episode of Knowledge Corner. All right, today's insight: love in a cold world. Love in a cold world. This comes from the song "Street Love" by Bankroll Freddie. My apologies, Bankroll Freddie. What led me to this song was the sample. The song samples "Love TKO" by Teddy Pendergrass. That's one of my favorite, probably the favorite Teddy P song that he's ever made, and he has a lot of classics. But I heard that bass playing at the beginning of Street Love, and I had to listen to it. But song talks about his rise in the streets and whatnot. But how he ends the song is where I want to focus on. I used to like listening to Ice-T back in the days because Ice-T was in the streets. But what Ice-T would do in his songs was he would he would show you the glamour side of that life. But at the end, there was always a consequence that happened. If you've ever watched the video for "I'm Your Pusher" by Ice-T, you can see that. So in the song Bankroll, the last thing Bankroll says is, "The streets don't love nobody." And that's what I want to focus on. The streets does not love nobody. If you look throughout history, anyone who's ever done anything in the streets, one or two things has always happened to them. Maybe three. Either they end up in jail or they end up dead. And in some cases, the amount of time you spend in the streets, a lot of people don't have anything to actually show for it. You look at the movie Paid in Full. If you've ever watched the movie Paid in Full, that actually was a true story. The characters in the movie, were Ace, Mitch, and Rico. The real life individuals were AZ, Rich, and Alpo. Alpo actually did kill Rich Porter, and it was over drugs. And regardless of how he tried to justify it. When I say he, I mean Alpo. He ended up dying the same way Rich did. Eventually, it took him some years for it to happen. But as I said, the streets don't love nobody. People were waiting for him to get out. And where Alpo went wrong was he left the witness protection program, and then he ended up going back to Harlem thinking that nothing was going to happen to him because he didn't tell on anyone from Harlem. But the thing is, though, the streets don't love you. And the people who were around and, that were in positions of authority and power, when he was initially out on the streets, those guys are probably not on the streets anymore. And he learned that lesson the hard way, so the streets don't love anyone. I have been, have followed the faith of Islam since I was in high school. And there are a lot of brothers that I have met over the years that I'm really close to. But the person that I am closest to the most is my best friend. My best friend is pretty much like my brother. And he's been that way since we were kids. It's always good to have one person in your corner, regardless of what you have going on. It's always good to have one person in your corner. Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. I love my friends. At this point, I have a lot more associates than I do friends. But a real brother is born for adversity. There have been times in my life where I've had to lean on individuals, in my darkest times. And I had people in my corner that I considered brothers that were able to help me out. I know a lot of people don't like, reaching out to people for help and whatnot. And I totally understand that. But sometimes you have to do that. God put us here to work with each other and to love each other. And if I can't, rely on my brother, in my time of need, then what am I here for? I am my brother's keeper. So I don't do it a lot because I always try to figure things out on my own. But I have, leaned on, friends, before. Surah Al-Hujurat, which is the 49th chapter or surah in the Quran, ayat 10, verse 10. The believers are but brethren. Therefore, make peace between your brethren and be careful of your duty to Allah, that mercy may be had on you. There have been times in my life that I have leaned on, my practicing of Islam. And every time I've done that, I've always been embraced by that other person. It doesn't matter if it's someone, in a store, or if they're, if I'm at a mechanic, if I found out that they're Muslim, that always helps me out, because that is a brotherhood. Can't say too much about that, from a Christian standpoint, because I haven't technically practiced the faith of Christianity since, I was a kid. But from on the outside looking in, I know there are individuals, who practice Christianity who look at each other as brothers. But on the flip side of that, I see a lot of hatred and animosity towards each, individuals who practice, Christianity. And if that's your brother, if you guys practice the same faith, you guys have to look at each other as brothers. But I understand, and my dad told me this when I was a kid, all people who say they're your brothers aren't your brothers. And that's something that you understand the older you get. Regardless of how well you know someone, you never know if they really have your back or not until you are in a area of adversity in your life. If you have someone that you thought was your brother and they don't help you, then that's someone that's not a brother. That's an associate. I've had a lot of associates in my life. I've had a lot of so-called friends in my life that I thought were friends, but at the end of the day, they weren't my friends. They were associates. I was never in the streets at all. Even when I wanted to be in the streets, I never was in the streets. So I can't say the streets don't love me because I was never in the streets. But what I can say is everyone who says they're your friend is not your friend. Everyone who may call you a brother or a sister is not your brother or your sister. You have to really use your discernment. You really have to use your knowledge, wisdom, and understanding to know who is there for you and who isn't there for you. So, love in the cold world. Bankroll Freddie. As always, like, comment, share, subscribe, and positive energy activates constant elevation. Peace.